can't hear.
Something happened. Is that okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, I'm going to start just by reading a document basically I've written, which is my thoughts about what we aimed to produce with this new edition. And then I'd be very interested to know in the course of our discussion, maybe later on, if the aims got through to you as the users, and whether it has made sense in the ways that I wanted it to make sense. How it started was that we began by asking ourselves the sort of all-important question, who would be using the edition? Mainly players, obviously, but we needed to think about the many different kinds of players of different ages, from school kids to professional string quartets, and different levels of players whose different levels of commitment. And just a few of those players might well have scholarly interests and therefore want to spend time delving into the edition for detailed information on how we arrived at our decisions. Of course, all of those users would have one thing in common: the expectation that they could trust our edition as being faithful to Haydn's intentions, along with parts that not only express that clearly, but are also helpful and feel natural to play from. But considering the rather sparse approach to performance markings in the Haydn autographs, and similarly in the parts his copyists produced, and their frequent lack of clarity and inconsistencies, it seems that the players Haydn worked with were expected, and very importantly, were trusted to fill in missing articulations, slurs, dynamics, etc. And therefore he didn't waste his time entering all these details himself. But what about 21st century players? Can players today be trusted to do the same? Would they even think of doing so? And do they really want to spend time researching 18th century materials when they could be coming up with their own solutions through discussion in rehearsals? This led us on to asking whether we, the editors, should be the ones to fill in the missing information, or should we instead encourage players to do as Haydn did and leave it to them to work it out for themselves? This implied that players would need to spend a fair proportion of their valuable time researching in order that they would feel empowered to make their own well-informed decisions. Of course, this would be asking a lot of players and is perhaps not quite what they're used to. So how could we satisfy and help all the different types of users, from those who wanted to rely entirely on our guidance to those who wanted to help themselves? It seemed to us there were two possible models that we could adopt, two different types of edition. The first would be a clear printed version of the composer's original text. And it does say on the covers that ours is an urtext edition. There's that lovely red band, which makes it sound very straightforward and reassuring, doesn't it? But in fact, to produce urtext of the Haydn string quartets is not so easy. First of all, only about half the autograph quartet manuscripts are extant. And the ones that do exist are often hard to make out. They're full of discrepancies and, not surprisingly, occasional apparent mistakes. And as I've already stressed, they are rather short on performance markings. It is largely only in the Opus 64 quartets that Haydn allows us to see his own corrections, a crucial insight for the editor. All the other autographs are more like fair copies that he would have handed over to his copyists. Then there is the problem of interpreting the autographs. Each of us here today, or if each of us here today were asked to copy out a typical Haydn string quartet autograph, exactly as it appears to us, then there is no doubt that we would come up with very different interpretations, even in places, different pitches. An alternative approach to making a new edition, an alternative that is to the impossible ideal, the perfect urtext, would be the opposite extreme. Full details of Haydn's discrepancies and ambiguities, as well as variants from all the other relevant contemporary authenticated sources shown in the actual score and parts, giving the players immediate access to all the information they might like to see, the various options they might want to choose from, on the same page they are playing from. But of course, parts showing all that information would be excessively cluttered and way too ungainly to perform from. So in the end, as we worked on the first set of Haydn quartets in our edition, that was the Opus 20s, this is what we aimed for. A text that we believed was faithful primarily to Haydn's original intentions, as in the extant autographs, but where necessary, making clarifications from the many handwritten copies and the more reliable early published editions. B, where there was a lack of clarity and where there were ambiguities in the manuscripts and inconsistencies, which were often probably just the result of Haydn saving time, clarifications would have to be made and crucially, clearly pointed out as such. We must always remember that Haydn was a phenomenally busy man, both as a composer and as a conductor of opera at Esterházy. And of course, he didn't have Sibelius software to make life easier for him. This is why the critical commentary in our edition, which you find at the back of each of the scores, it has such a vital role to play. C, our own rules about these clarifications we were to make, which involved adding performance markings, etc., would only be made when they could be shown to be one of the following, and strictly in this order of importance. 1, they would be based on analogous places in the same movement. 2, taken from other secondary authenticated sources. And only then, and as a last resort, 3, based on our own solutions where neither of the previous were apparent or satisfactory. So putting our own thoughts last, as it were. Most modern editions are closer to urtext than ever before, but this can give rise to problems, things that really annoy players, such as variant pitches in well-known works that quartets are used to hearing and playing differently. I well remember the frustration of finding many such variants in the Bärenreiter urtext editions of the Mozart string quartets of 1962 and the string quintets, which came out in 1967, as well as inconsistencies of articulation and slurs, in brackets missing dynamics, all of which to players' sensibilities can so deeply affect interpretation and their love of the music even. They just weren't used to this. I mean, we weren't. Also, in reading composers' autographs, it is important to realize that each composer has his or her own writing habits. For example, slurs that start too far to the right or too far to the left, which was Haydn's tendency, according to Laszlo Zsomfai, or long slurs drawn carelessly or vaguely. Are some of them phrasings rather than actual bowings? And how does one distinguish between the two? What about staccato strokes versus staccato dots? What is the difference between the two? What does or can each of them mean? We will deal with that later. So we found there was one pitfall after another and many sleepless nights resulted. As an editor, you have to become aware of these eccentricities. Making a new edition of Haydn quartets feels like a huge responsibility. A new edition may be in use for 100 years or more, and may become the primary source of a composer's text around the world. And one has to remember that players tend to believe that what they see on the printed page is what the composer intended, a final product that stays the same forever. This may be less true now than 50 years ago, although conversely, modern editions are closer to composers' autographs than ever before. And we mostly realize, I think, that printed urtext is never exactly the whole or precise truth. It cannot possibly be. In the end, I'm sorry to say, urtext is not all that it's trumped up to be by the publishers who produce it. Hopefully the tide is turning and players are becoming more willing to spend time looking at the vast amount of information contained in a good modern edition. If they do take the trouble to do this with our edition, then they are making the most of it by using it as a do-it-yourself kit. Players are then, to some extent, doing the same job that the editors have already done, but in their own way, and without having to spend years traveling to libraries and private collections around the world gathering the relevant information. Not that that wasn't fun, I must add. And perhaps as players become familiar with a particular edition, they develop an instinct for distinguishing between what they can trust to the editor's judgment and what they feel they need to research for themselves. A healthy situation, I think, and one that is truly respectful to the music. Of course, the internet is a great thing when it comes to seeing composers' manuscripts and early editions, more and more so. And I'm convinced that the more time players spend with the actual autographs, the closer they'll come to understanding the composer's original intentions, what composers actually felt at the time of writing their music. It's more than just a question of simple accuracy. A composer's manuscript style might to some extent indicate how they imagine their music being played, just by how it looks in the score. I find this is particularly true in Bach's solo violin sonatas and partitas, where the manuscript is in itself so expressive. But the danger with any newfangled do-it-yourself editions such as ours is, of course, that players can't be bothered to do their own research, even when most of the information is handed to them on a plate in the form of a comprehensive critical commentary. And therefore, they are not seeing the whole picture. This is why we insisted on Peter's edition including our commentary that comes with each set of parts in the back of the score, rather than publishing it in a separate volume, which is what happens in the Händler edition. It's probably true to say that players who use the Händler edition are only very rarely buy copies of the commentaries or go to a library to look at such supplements. Instant access, as in the new Peters edition, will hopefully encourage them, or you, to find out more and become your own editors. So that, I hope, gives a sort of brief idea of what we were aiming for. I'm going to move on now to some of the most important questions that came along. These are to do with actual musical text very often. And so that you can see the kind of things that happened. It's sort of like Chinese whispers. Haydn writes a manuscript, it gets passed on to his own copyists, his team of copyists, typically at Esterházy. And they're wonderful copyists. And they're so faithful that if there's something that's not clear in a Haydn manuscript, they'll copy that same lack of clarity into their own. So that then gets passed on to other copyists who make copies which are sent out to the elite, the aristocracy of Europe, who are going to be playing and using these scores, paying thousands of pounds, the equivalent of, to have a set of Haydn quartets. They were very expensive, these handwritten copies. And then some of those find their ways to publishers. For instance, the Opus.20 quartets were published no less than, I think, by 6 different publishing companies within 5 years of their being finished. So you can imagine how things change gradually, and editors take it upon themselves to make their own corrections in their own ways. And so we come up with all kinds of different versions of the same music. So I'm going to show you a few good examples of the kind of thing we discovered as we were making our edition, and had great pleasure in putting right, correcting. We're going to look at the very first one on this list is from the string quartet Opus 33 number 4. If we could look at that score. Yep. Now, right, so we're looking at the scherzo. And we're going to hear little extracts in a minute, but we can't unfortunately look and hear at the same time. So we're just going to hear the first 8 bars, just so that you're familiar with which movement it is we're listening to. And then we're going to go to the minore section, the trio, as it were. Can we just scroll down a little bit? And I want you to notice there's a bar in brackets here with a little, those numbers 2 signify that this has something to do with the text, and that the 2 refers to the section you need to look at in the critical commentary. And that bar was deemed inappropriate by J.J. Hummel, who was a publisher in Berlin and Amsterdam. And he actually had the nerve to remove it. And of course, the problem with that was that his edition got copied by many other editions. And so it came right down to the Eulenburg, the Peters edition, the old Peters edition. And so that's how we always heard this piece. Without that bar. So you can see that that's a 9-bar phrase, as this is our edition. And if you take that 1 square bracket bar out, it becomes a more conventional 8-bar phrase, which sounds perfectly fine, but it's not actually what Haydn wrote. So if we could hear, first of all, the first example, this is the Aeolian Quartet, just playing the first 8 bars of the Minuet scherzo.
And
okay, and then the next one we're going to hear the first section from the same recording with the Aeolian of the first section, the first 8 bars of the Minore section, the trio. Okay, thank you. So I hope you were counting, that was 8 bars. And now we'll hear what Haydn actually wrote, which was 9 bars with the extra bar as played by the Quattro Mosaic. So, you know, so beautiful, the line in that music, and so natural, but way too original for some publishers who corrected it, as it were. Rather beautifully played, I thought, that particular example there. The second one comes from one of the Opus 20 quartets. And this is the beginning of the first movement, just so you can identify the piece. And then we're going to scroll down to 2 B and C. And you will see that this is just the end of that movement. And if you look at the last bar, it's a G minor chord. So this is the G minor quartet. And the second violin plays G, the first violin plays G, the cello plays G, and the viola plays D. And so there's no B flat in that chord. And of course, if it's the last chord in the piece, I suppose the composition manual will tell you you must have all parts of the chord in it. And so what does J.J. Hummel do? He turns that G in the second violin to a B flat. Maybe just skip on to that end of the movement example. So 2B, no, sorry, I mean the music example could be here 2B, which is the end of the movement as played by the Aeolian. So you'll hear the B flat in the last chord. That sounds like a very complete chord. And now the mosaic with the right chord. It's a much darker effect. It's much more in keeping with this extraordinary piece of music. That is one of the weirdest, most wonderful quartets he ever wrote. Actually, all the Opus 20s are. And I know you're working on the 4th one at the moment, so we're going to talk a bit about that later. The third example was totally outrageous what happened here. This is from Opus 15, number 3. There's the Minuet. Whoops. There's the Minuet. And I look at the theme, the first few bars, and now let's skip down to the trio. It's the same theme, isn't it? With different articulation, but it's exactly the same, except you'll see the minuet's in F major, and so is the beginning of the trio in F major. But until we get to the D flat that everybody plays, which is a total shock and a surprise. We're not expecting that. He's put a sforzato on it to make it really clear that that's, you know, we've got to notice it, that it's not a D natural. Okay, so basically what happens then, it makes you think that we've gone into A flat major or F minor, and basically most of the rest of the trio is in A flat, but it ends in F minor, relative minor. So somebody early on thought, oh, well, why didn't the silly fool Haydn just put an F minor key signature in there, make it so much easier? The only problem, if you do that at the beginning, can we just look at the beginning of the trio again? Yeah. Oh, sorry, no, not the minuet, the trio, down to the next page. Yes, stop. If you put a 4 flats key signature there at the beginning of the trio, you would see that you would immediately get a D flat in that first bar and in the second bar. So it would immediately sound in the minor or minor mode from the beginning of the trio, whereas Haydn actually wanted a surprise, that D flat only to come as a surprise. So he makes you think, what on earth is he doing? He's using the same tune for the trio in the same key, but then it isn't. You get that wonderful surprise. It's such a clever and wonderful thing to do, the thought that someone could destroy that. And I think it was very interesting to us too, that the other mistake that we found, that conventionally, I mean, you always repeat both halves of the minuet and trio. There was no repeat marking in this one. And there's a very good reason, because that surprise, you couldn't really keep doing it again. I mean, you wouldn't do it twice because it wouldn't have the same effect. So he actually very sensibly didn't repeat that section. Which is very unusual, that, but he didn't do it. So if we could hear all the examples that go with that, that would be great. We're just going to hear the beginning of the minuet, first of all. Is this a Kodai quartet? And now the beginning of the trio on the same recording. Well, this is the end of the minuet. Okay, thank you. So you could hear how that sounds immediately as though it's in F minor and then modulates into the relative major. Now we'll hear with the Buchberger quartet exactly what Haydn wrote. This is, again, the very end of the minuet and then the beginning of the trio. That's one more key. Just for time's sake, we're not going to listen to the examples of this one, but I just want you to look at number 4. And here's the A major, Opus 20, number 6. Very lively allegro di molto movement. So just going on now, jumping forward to the end of the development section. Okay, we can see in a few bars along, we see a 3/8 bar and it's a 6/8 movement. What on earth is a 3/8 bar doing there? But the 3/8 and the 6/8 is in brackets, meaning it's editorial. But that is actually exactly what he wrote. I mean, I studied that manuscript over and over again, thinking, I don't quite believe this. And what happens is you get a feeling of the 6/8 going along, and then there's just an extra beats rest, because you know how he loved to have these sudden rests and surprises. There's another long rest coming up a few bars later. You can see a whole bar. And if you leave that out, that rest, it just sounds very ordinary. Whereas that little breath in the middle is just fantastic. And so again, publishers remove that and squash those 2 bars into one, making one 6/8 bar, meaning the rest is gone. I thought, what a shame. So I put that back in, but it was slightly sticking my neck out to say that he could change time signature in the middle of a movement. Of course, we'd think nothing of it today, but it hadn't really been done in those days. Example 5. You will all know this quartet very well, Opus 54, number 1. Let's just hear that opening passage. Sacconi Quartet. Can we go back to the score? Did you get a shock? Anybody, when you got to that E minor chord in bar 24? I don't know whether it surprised anybody. If you already know my edition, then it won't surprise you, but this came from, there's no autographed manuscript of this whole piece, but there is a sketch that he wrote, and it's very clearly that chord. It's not the same G major chord as at the beginning, which is what you're used to hearing and seeing in all previous editions. And I thought, well, it actually works very well. So I'm going to leave that as he wrote it. 6. This comes from, as you go on to the next page, 6b, and this is the first of the Opus 20 quartets, and in E flat, wonderfully beautiful, generous, relaxed kind of movement. And go on to C now, example C. Oh, sorry, I should have corrected the rotation. Can you? Oh, you can do that. Now look at that. Do you see what, this is when I started. This is the first piece I edited. And I just thought, oh, what am I ever going to do with that? I mean, what do those bowings mean? They're all just sort of, they could be all sorts of things. They're not complete. They could be anything. I've got my viola here, and I'll show you. When I first started, I was convinced it was this. So with the articulation. But then looking at the many other copies and versions and thinking of the character of the piece, was how I then began to see it. Another version I found was this, which was really boring. That was in the French edition, the André edition that came out, just a few years after they were written. Artaria's edition, which came out 30 years later, was definitely the was that one, which is what I used. And this is a good example of thinking really of the character of the music and that movement and what it feels like. I mean, the first version I showed you, the very articulated one, had a lot more spirit, but it's not marked with spirit, and it doesn't really seem to be that kind of music. So, but honestly, I tell you, that was about a week of thinking about it and just not sleeping very well and thinking, if it's going to be like this, I want to stop right now, because this could go on for years. And actually, almost all of the quartets had, I mean, not as quite as puzzle, as serious a puzzle as that, but they all had something along those lines. And you would see, I mean, that little motif in that quartet, it comes maybe 60 times in that first movement. And then you decide it's one thing and you get so excited about that and you keep reading through it, and then suddenly it's different. It's not marked over 2 notes, it's marked over 3 notes or over 4 or something totally different. And you think, well, what on earth is the reason for that? And then you make up a little story. You think, oh, well, actually, it's in a different key now. It actually means something slightly different and it's going in a different direction. So actually, you could make that work. And that's all very fine. Then you go on to the next one and it doesn't make any sense in those same terms at all. So you kind of give up. So there are times when the editor just has to say, okay, it's going to be this. But the nice thing about our edition, I think, is that it's pointing that out loud and clear to the user, that you can see there are alternative versions. So, you know, go and see what the others are in the commentary and then make your own minds up. Dynamics. I would think it might be a good idea to talk about those. The edition, you might have noticed, has, particularly up as far as the Opus 64 quartet, so the first 4 volumes, have opening dynamics, mostly in square brackets. Not always, and square brackets just means they're editorial. And this was because Peter's edition at that stage wouldn't publish anything without a dynamic at the beginning of each movement. It doesn't matter who the composer was or what period it was from. That was their policy. And we argued about it for ages. And I thought, oh, well, we'll just have to put up with that. So we came up with this idea that, I mean, some movements are very clearly forte in character, you know, and there's nothing wrong with putting a forte in square brackets at the beginning. It's just a suggestion. And maybe there's a piano 8 bars along, you know, into the movement that contrasts with the opening. Others, it's not so clear. And so we still had to put something when it wasn't so clear. And that became very difficult because if you put a piano, that in Haydn suggests something very special. It's very rare that he will put a piano at the beginning of the movement. He does, doesn't he, in No.4, one that you're working on. Yeah, he wrote a piano, and I mean, hardly ever an opening dynamic in the early quartet. So that's amazing that he wrote that. But that means he wanted a very particularly hushed type of sound, I think, for that piece. And so that works very well. But most of them have a more sort of upfront kind of opening, which perhaps piano wouldn't suit at all, but neither does forte really. So we came up with the idea of forte in a square bracket with an asterisk. And the asterisk was meaning that go to the beginning of the edition at one of the, I think it comes just right in the first couple of pages. And it explains the fact that what we're saying here is that the forte isn't really a forte at all. It's just the natural speaking voice of the instrument. It's the natural voice of the music. So it could be anything, I suppose, really, from mezzo piano to poco forte, or even a real forte, but probably unlikely to be a real forte. But it still felt very unsatisfactory. And hopefully one day, I'm still working on it, of trying to persuade them when they get reprinted, which they do from time to time, that they let me actually change that. But so far they're not relented, which is extremely annoying. There we are. non-matching bowing's an interesting thing. You've probably come across this kind of thing quite a bit, have you? And I find that when I saw them originally, you would just think I would be like any other player, particularly if I was playing from an edition where that happened. I think, well, how irritating, why can't I as viola do the same bowing as the second violin? Why should it be different? But again, you know, you can often find a reason to argue it either way. And if I found that there was something it did when you actually try it and that it enlivened the texture or enlightened the texture in some way, the non-matching, then I would keep that in. But if it didn't seem to serve a purpose, then sometimes I would just, I'm afraid, change it, again with a note in the score to show that it had been changed. So those are the kind of things we had to deal with. Dots and strokes, I did say I'd say something about those. Example 9, can we look at that one? Sorry, 9B, I wanted to say.
9B, okay.
The reason I'm wanting to look at this is because I think people think that the strokes, some people call them daggers or carrots or whatever, but they are called staccato strokes, as opposed to dots. They can mean all sorts of things, but there's a tendency to, you see those things and you think, oh, they must be sort of really hard articulations. They must be very short or very strongly articulated. In piano, then they'd be sort of perhaps a bit bizarrely short and very soft. But actually, that doesn't seem to be the case, because it can he often puts one at the end of a soft phrase, meaning just that note's dying away and can be a little bit short. So it can mean de-accent a note, or it could mean in a forte, in a strong character, accent a note. Like at the beginning of the Opus 54 #1 that we just heard, I mean, he does put them at the beginning in the accompaniment. So, you know, they would be strong and highly articulated. But for instance, these at the end of this extraordinarily beautiful slow movement, it would be completely inappropriate to play them sort of really, really short. So I, in the end, came up with the idea that staccato strokes always means think about it. You know, treat them as an exclamation mark and think, oh, right, what does he want here? He wants me to do something special. And in that way, they can be just about anything. I mean, they're always going to be detached from the note either side, but they can be just about anything. I wonder whether at this point we should move on to some of your questions.
Yeah.
Would that be a good idea?
Okay. Well, Quartet, shall we just address the question from us?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I have the list, and then well, yes, so what's the process of research, and then you included that, but
I think so, but maybe I should say a tiny bit more about it. But, just to make it very clear that there were 3 possibilities. There was the Haydn autograph, then there were the copyists. Johann Elsler was the name of the copyist at Esterházy, who was so wonderful, and his family, and they were all very good copyists. And then there was a team of about 10 copyists in Vienna who copied the copies that were sent out to the elite people who could afford them. And then the publishers took over. And so that's how many of the problems came up. And when I started with the Opus 20s, I thought, well, I must look at lots of different sorts. In fact, I think there were no handwritten copies that I could find. So it was the autograph, which was great that there was an autograph, although, as you can see, very hard to read and interpret. And then I used 4 different editions, I think, or 5, maybe even 5. So I was comparing bar by bar all these different editions, and it took a very, very long time to get anywhere and to make any conclusions. So in the end, I think it was more assessing the different sources that were available. You have to become very good at that. So you don't actually start with too many, you know, probably 3 is enough. But you need to be pretty cast iron in what you're using, so that it's got some direct.
I mean, can you name those editions which you used as?
Well, they were different for the different opuses. Actually, they changed quite a bit. The Artaria edition, which some people think is absolutely wonderful, I don't, I'm afraid, because it came so much later. I mean, particularly the Opus.20s, which came 30 years after that. I actually sent you a page. I don't know whether that's set up in a way that it can be seen.
Oh yes, I can prepare that now.
I forgot to mention it before. It doesn't really matter, but I'll just describe it. It's just that he puts lots of different bones. He bones over much longer phrases, so more notes in one bow. The editor in that edition, and lots of dynamics, and there are hairpins up and down and things like that. So lots of expression marks that Haydn just never used at that point. So it seems extremely unlikely. And I thought if I use too much of that kind of thing in this edition, it's just going to look like a modern edited edition, but being edited from the editor's own personal preferences. You know, we can all do that. We can also all put markings in an edition. There it is. You see those long slurs over whole bars. I mean, he never wrote that. There's a tie and a forte right in the middle of the screen. There's a forte and there's a tie. He didn't write that. There's hairpins. Do you see what I mean? Crescendos, pianos, they're all nonsense. It's not what he wrote. And although the publishers claimed that Haydn had proofread this and it was, the corrections were all with his approval, there's absolutely no evidence of that from Haydn himself. There's no correspondence. And it seems highly unlikely. I mean, how could Haydn have had time to proofread? And he didn't, apparently. And he wasn't very good at it when he did it. So he wouldn't even remember those quartets properly by that point. His memory was going at that age, and he wasn't sure what quartets he'd written when. Can't blame him, he wrote so many. So really, it's so complicated, that first question.
Yeah.
Painstaking, and I used to do it at night very often, or get up at 4 in the morning and work for a few hours, because I found that the best time I could really concentrate. But I did take a couple of years off teaching, so I could concentrate on this. That got me started, and I got through a few volumes, and then the rest kind of just happened.
I can skip to the question of what inspired you to create this edition. And I mean, you told us that the team of publisher, but was it your self-initiated process coming from your performer's background, or how?
Well, it sort of did come from me, in that, as you mentioned, the Bach edition in your nice introduction. That was the first. There are 2 Bach editions now, because I've done the violin sonatas and partitudes as well for viola. But the cello suite one was the first thing I ever did in the mid-90s, and it really came about because I'd made a recording of the suites, and in making the recording, I found that all the editions that existed were really just records of how particular players played those suites, which was lovely to have it and extremely interesting. And one of them was my teacher, Bruno Girardin. So I was, valued them enormously. But I thought, today you can't make an edition of something like that, and I didn't want to do that. And so that made me go back to these sources and produce something of my own. And then they published that. I offered it to Peters, and they said yes, and published it, and it seemed to go down quite well. And then I was just in their office one day talking to the head of publishing. I said, do you have any idea when you're going to do something about your terrible old editions of the string quartets of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven? Jokingly, they said, which one do you want to do first? I said, well, let's start with Haydn and then I'll probably be dead, I should think, by the time I finish that. But it didn't take so long, only 15 years. But I'm not tempted to do any more huge projects like that. And of course, there are still the pre-Opus 20 quartets, the 10 very early ones, and then the Opus 9s and the Opus 17s. At some point, they really ought to be done. And the reason they're not is because they're not commercially very viable. I mean, they just reckon they wouldn't sell enough copies. But maybe one day they'll sort of work backwards towards the beginning. So yes, it was madness. I just said, yeah, I'm dying to do that. And then I thought, what have I done? This is really crazy. But I don't regret it. I mean, being a composer too, I mean, to spend your time examining that music from every angle for so long, I just felt like I got to know Haydn and he became my teacher in a way. I mean, it was a wonderful feeling. Such sort of warm feeling towards his music.
So unique your profile that you being composer and a performer, so you have the understanding of both. And what really strikes me from your previous talk, that kind of trust, like having the trusting edition, so that musician or people can refer to the most trusting. And then that's I find that really kind of humbling kind of word.
Thank you very much.
So some of the questioning, I wonder, Quartet, do you want to mention this?
I just wanted to ask about the sforzandos. What's the difference between sforzando and forzando?
Nearly everything to do with those kinds of dynamics and ornaments, when it's hard to read, it's often no difference. It's just, you can't tell which it is. But when it comes to actually having to interpret something like that, I notice this when I'm teaching, I'd always say, you know, what's the context? What do you think? What makes musical sense to you? I don't think there is probably any difference between those two, but as he used them both, one may as well put them both in the edition.
That's really good to know. Thanks. Just because, I mean, I know it seems like a silly question, but
no,
when I see sforzando, it looks more intense. It looks like maybe it needs to be more violent than the forzando, but it's good to hear that it's probably the same thing.
Yes, and either could be quite unviolent, given a softer context, you know. It's yeah. So I think that's all important, really.
Okay, go ahead, Carmen.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank you for you know, bringing attention to the wedges markings, because actually that has been something for years we've been questioning, you know, how do you play it? But actually in the context that you say, to kind of look at it as a, you know, put an exclamation mark there, or pay attention to how this, again, how it relates to the context, that completely changes how I view playing those wedges now. So thank you for that enlightenment.
I'm glad. I was at the Royal College of Music where I teach, but one day I was just having lunch and Roger Norrington was there, and he came up to me and he said, he knew that I was doing this edition somehow, and he said, I hope you're not going to make any difference between staccato dots and wedges in Haydn, because there isn't one. They're all the same. And I said, well, I'm sorry, Roger, I'm afraid it's too late. There are already some volumes and I have made a difference. I have to say, I think maybe it could possibly be different in the quartets from the symphonies. He did actually agree in the end that that was all right. But yeah.
There's just a quick question in the chat, Simon. Sorry, excuse my little commentary here. It's just, can you always tell in the autograph the difference?
Actually, well, that's one thing that you seem to be able to tell, that's fairly striking, the difference in the autographs between the dots and the strokes. Although, I mean, of course, using an old pen and ink like that, I suppose some of them could easily have misfired and come out as the other thing. But yeah, I think on the whole, it's clear. And I mean, for instance, if you see dots under a slur, meaning a sort of stroke that stops in the string, like in the bird first movement, you would, they're always dots. I don't think he ever wrote strokes under a slur. So he was careful to do that.
Mm.
And the strokes are very strokey when he uses them.
Mm. I have a question that it's not a question I listed previously, but so looking at the autograph closely, do you feel like you understand the person, Haydn?
Well,
or perhaps this is the process for any of this kind of editorial process.
I do. I mean, actually, have you ever picked up an autograph by a great composer? Have you ever put one in your hands? Had one in your hands? Because, or has anybody? Because I mean, I'll never forget the first time. It was the Opus 64 #1, which is housed at the Royal College of Music in the library, and I was just teaching all day, and I went down just shortly after I was agreed to start this project, and I went down. I said, "I think you've got a Haydn autograph," and they said, "Oh, do you want to see it?" I said, "Well, yes, do I need to make an appointment?" They said, no, just go and wait, and then we'll bring it to you. And then 2 minutes later, there it was. And I really wasn't prepared. I mean, it practically brought tears to my eyes. I mean, that the shiver went up my back when I opened this score, and you're actually holding the very thing that you'd written was extraordinary, and turning the pages and looking through it. So there is that, first of all. You do feel some sort of wonderful connection meeting. But I do think there is something in the way a composer writes. You can see something of the character of the music sometimes. Yes, I do. I think it does mean something. Of course, it's wonderful now that you can see so many of these things on the internet. I mean, when I did my Bach and when I did most of the Haydn, nothing really was there. Now you can just switch your computer on and see most of it. It's fantastic. And some people actually learn their Bach sonatas and partitas from the manuscript, don't they? I think that's really brave, actually. I'm not sure. They're not that easy to read. So I'm amazed that they do that.
Simon, there is another question in the chat. It says, what would have been the effect of playing these with old instruments and bows?
Well, very beautiful, I think. And I think a lot of people are doing that, aren't they? And although I've noticed now, I mean, you think of the Quattro Mosaic, they use modern instruments and bows, I think, but they lower the pitch a little bit and maybe use different strings from, not the really strong modern strings. The Doric Quartet, for instance, use classical bows. They do extraordinary, and they do all kinds of funny short bowings at the point, I've noticed, which I would never have thought of doing in my quartet playing days. It was always off the string, was sort of further down towards the heel, but they do that, and it sounds great. There's no doubt. So, I mean, you're not going to project in the same way, but I think this combination of using a modern instrument and maybe playing at modern pitch doesn't really matter too much, and but with the different bow is a great idea. And I think the other thing that I do try to sort of look at with young quartets that come to play Haydn to me is if I feel that vibrato is just happening because it happens and they would use it whatever they were playing without thinking about it, then I do very much encourage people to think about what's actually coming out in terms of that left-hand expression. Not banning it, but thinking of using it where it's important to use it, or where it makes musical sense to use it, to think about it, not just let it happen automatically. Yeah.
Okay, so the question course member forwarded to us, is it correct that Opus 20 quartets were probably written mainly for the playing in a private setting? Is there any evidence that they were given any public performance during his time? Do you know these things?
No, I mean, actually, there's, well, there was hardly any public performance, was there? I mean, it just didn't happen in the 18th century. It was in, but I mean, I suppose these huge houses like the Esterház's, they might have had quite a lot of guests in their house, which would have been something like public performances. But the quartets mostly were written for the people to play at home themselves. And people were dying to get their hands on the latest opus by Haydn, you know, they would do anything to get it. There's a wonderful, I actually pulled this book out this morning because I noticed that question. This is the Cambridge Companion to String Quartet. And there's the very first article in it is really excellent. It's by Christina Bashford and it's called The String Quartet and Society. And it's about exactly that, how it gradually changed. But it wasn't really till the beginning of the 19th century that public performance came. But funnily enough, in London, Salomon did have success with public concerts, but they were mostly orchestral and arias. And then when Haydn came to London in the 90s, the 1790s, two famous visits to London, quartets were included in those concerts, but they weren't quartet concerts like quartet concert at Wigmore Hall would be today. They were, you would hear an aria, you would hear a symphony, and then a quartet would come on the stage and no one would even notice what they were doing properly because they weren't big and noisy. It took a little while to tune into what was going on, but then they became hugely popular. But always sort of mixed in with other types of music. But actually those Salomon concerts started, I think, in the middle of the 18th century, so they went quite far back, those public concerts. It's interesting.
Amazing. Another question, what's the evidence of the Haydn trill? So that's
The ornament.
Ornament, yeah.
The Haydn ornament. I think one just has to go on I mean, that was the person who was the great expert on this seemed to be Laszlo Zomfai, a Hungarian Haydn expert, and he really writes about that very well. I can't remember where you find that, but I mean, they can be, again, they can be all kinds of things, those Haydn ornaments. They're basically just, can you hear that? Just a little turn like that. But they can be, if it's tied over 1, 2, 3, it can be like that as well. So they're usually rather sort of smooth, but they're basically like a turn coming from the upper note. Or something like that. There could be, so do something, some little turn. But I think the interesting one not to forget, because people often see, this is in the G minor. Do you have any scores of the Opus 20 hanging around in front of you? If you do, it is in that first minuet. I mean, the minuet. One, two, three. And people often play, that is not a Haydn ornament, that's too complicated. It's the simplest possible way out of that situation, which is 2, 3. Yeah.
Great.
I don't know whether there's real evidence for all of that, and that there is a specific thing. Maybe he meant, maybe it was his way of just drawing a turn, but I like to think that it was meant to be something different.
Mm. So,
Again,
so
I think,
certainly it's not like a Leopold Mozart instruction.
no, but actually, no, Leopold Mozart, there was another interesting question here about the triplets in the D major quartet in the first movement, wasn't there? That you had, whether to slur them.
Yeah.
There's lots of triplets in that movement, lively, it's always in the sort of excitable.
So the question for the Cosman, but the question is what bowing would, this is for Opus 20 number for particular question, what bowing would Haydn have expected his contemporary to add to his score on first or second time through for the triplets?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much choice anywhere else, is there? Because it's all beautifully written in, I think. It's very hard to say, because again here, it seems that there's such a feeling of sotto voce legato at the beginning, and these wonderful conversational phrases, and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. And then suddenly there's this forte outburst, and the effect is of something completely opposite to what we've had. And to actually start putting a lot of slurs in it would reduce that contrast in some way. So what I don't believe in doing, this is just personal perhaps, but is the idea that, okay, you just play it as it looks once without any slurs. And then the second time you go through, I'm going to use my imagination and add lots of slurs. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily always the right thing to do. Because it could just turn it into a character that's not really what is intended. And I think that it's more interesting, from my point of view, is to think about where are the phrases going? What could we, I mean, I do believe that when you play the first part through, that the first time, that you should make it sound I don't want to, I was going to say the most obvious way, but what harmonically makes most complete sense to you in your understanding of that music is what you should do. When you repeat it, there is the possibility to go against that in some ways, to meaningfully contrast that and to do something a little bit different. That might involve things like adding slurs or taking slurs out or doing some different kind of articulation or different dynamics. But it's the wrong way round to think of it as I need to do something different because it's a repeat in terms of the performance markings. I think it must be some understanding of the music that makes you change the performance markings, some different reflection on that same piece of music. I was going to say this. Yes, if you go on to the second movement of your quartet, the variation movement, and you get to variation 3, the first violin has a lot of triplets again. It's a very expressive movement, this one. Wonderful movement. So you could say, yes, we could put some slurs into that. So you could actually, for instance, looking at that first part of variation 3, you could do it without any slurs the first time. The second time round, because it's such an expressive movement, you could add to the expression. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, by doing just tiny little bits of slurs, like, for instance, particularly semitones. You know, as Leopold Mozart would say, when the intervals are wide, you tend not to slur, and when they're close together, the tendency is to add slurs. So, for instance, in bar 56, that C sharp to D, could be a slur. Bum. So slur, slur, not slur, slur. But to just decide to put 3 notes in a slur and then 3 separate or something wouldn't do it, because it wouldn't actually change, wouldn't enhance the feeling of the character of the music, I feel. So I think one should definitely feel free to do them, but not always at a whim. I mean, to sort of try and have some sense of what might have been performance practice, like as it is in all those ideas. And but also according to what you feel about the piece.
It's quite interesting, Simon. I always think, like in the first movement, sorry, it's Katie here. Just thinking about the in the first movement, like the triplets, if it's in a sort of more easygoing feel, to think that like using slurs to sort of enhance that rather than a sort of more strong. But in that second movement, it's very interesting to think about. I wondered what your thought was on sort of when it's making a scale, and whether that was a sort of indication that you could slur things as a scale, or do you think it's mostly the semitones?
So, like in the second part of that variation, are you thinking?
Yeah, when it's like da 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 da, you know, when you have a few notes together as a scale, if that was performance practice.
I would say yes, it is, and it could certainly work in places. I think the important thing is not ever to sort of put so much in terms of extra bowings or extra slurs that it becomes your variation. Do you know what I mean? I think it must always still have that the character of the piece, or whatever you think that is, how you've interpreted it. And so less is more. We just don't do too much. It's always my advice. And the same with ornaments, actually. I can't stand it when I hear Haydn sort of ornamented just for the sake of it. It begins to sound like a Scottish dance or something. It's sort of very irritating. It's perfectly fine what he wrote. There's lots of ways of making the music speak differently without adding lots of ornaments.
We have another chat question, actually a couple, in variation 2 in the same movement.
Yes.
Again, how would you decide what sort of grace note or appoggiatura or cacciatura to use, for instance, in bar 2?
Well,
yes.
Well, I would just get my view. So this is rather than, because to me this is very expressive. Yeah, that it needs that.
I'm so pleased because that's how I play it.
Oh, well done.
Yes.
And actually, that's strictly speaking what you're supposed to do, isn't it? Because you should always play whatever the appoggiatura is made of, whether it appears as a quaver or a semiquaver or a crotchet, it doesn't make any difference. It's half the value of the main note. Not only that, but it needs to be lent on because it's a form of expression rather than writing 2 semiquavers. If you write that, that means the grace note probably has got more weight, more expression than the second note, than the main note. So it turns the whole thing, that's what makes it necessary to use that sign. Otherwise, why would he do it? So yeah, that would be my answer. And by the way, they're never slurred, but I mean, you would always slur them, but he never wrote the slurs in, so I didn't either. I mean, that's just something you need to know about music of this period, in case anybody's thought about that.
I wanted to go back to your thoughts on the ornamentation, that's in particularly on repeats. And I remember something in your notes that was really nice, where you had used a word, if you do ornamentation, do it discreetly.
Yes.
So how much, again, probably back to your same theme of the ornamentation has to fit into, if you do it, the concept of the music. But, how much is too much? How much is too little? Do you not do any? What just depends on how you feel.
I think you could, it can be done by some very clever people spontaneously, I think, but just not to get too carried away with that. I mean, it's very hard to be precise, isn't it? I can't say, but just very little. Something, one thing. The music's so beautiful as it is, you can easily hear it twice without getting bored for a second. And if you do one little thing that just highlights something, you'll remember that forever. You'll think, oh, wasn't that beautiful what they did? And if you did 8 things in that same 8 bars, you think, oh, they did an awful lot of ornamentation. Oh, well, that was very impressive. But it's not going to maybe touch you in the same way.
Do you think it comes back to the same thing you said about bowings, that it should serve, if you're adding bowings, it should serve the music, not your own sort of ego, not sort of showing off what you can do?
Most definitely. Most definitely. It's got to be that way around. And, the more you love the music and the more you see in it, that is such an incredible movement, that slow movement. I find that point when it gets to bar 89, we've come the full circle of the variations, and it comes back, and that wonderful sequence, descending sequence, it's one of the most moving things in all music for me. That I think is divine. And then what he goes on to do to finish the movement is so extraordinary, unexpected. Everything you would never think that could happen. If you were hearing that for the first time, you would be just amazed.
I have a question from the member here. What's your take on the third movement structure and the function of the forzando? And then is there any underlying rhythmic structure or like symmetry patterns of forzando in the minuet?
Yes, I mean, you can't really say, but I mean, I think what he's having a little bit of fun here, either trying to trip up imaginary dancers, or he's actually turning a minuet into perhaps a gavotte, for a few bars, and you think, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a minuet. Why is it in 2 time? Why is it in duple time? And it should be in triple time. And then you don't know until you get to the end of the section, and suddenly all's well with the world again, and we're back in as it should be in 3. So that was just Haydn. I mean, he knew lots of different dances too. You remember, he was born just on the border with Hungary, and so he was very well versed in a very humble background, but he knew a lot of these quite rustic kinds of dances. And I think he just liked to sort of mix it all up. You hear all this music in his music, but it always ends with the most wonderful sort of refinement and cadence that brings you home, so you know where you are. He does that harmonically all the time, doesn't he, too? It takes you to places you don't think you should quite be doing that. And then it comes back and you just feel this like letting go, this wonderful relief. And it's amazing. I should stop saying that sometimes.
I see this quite a nice question, which is what changes do you see in Haydn's scores or way of writing over the years? Any interesting ways he generally changed his writing?
A little bit more in terms of dynamic markings, and in the Opus 77, isn't there an example in my examples actually? Is the one there of the slow movement? Well, I wish I could find it quickly. I can't find it now. Maybe it isn't there. It was the slow movement of Opus 77, number 1. The one that begins in. There. Oh, there, yes. You had the manuscript of it. You
That one. Here?
need to go back a page.
Go up one page.
Up one page, yeah.
That one.
There it is. Lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, you would never have seen anything of that sophistication in the early quartets. But what on earth does it all mean? I mean, okay, we got a forte to start with. The second bar, you've got those up bows, but they're under the note rather than on top of the note. But maybe people hadn't used those signs much, and maybe he either intended them as accents or they were up bows, but he just put them in the wrong place. Diminuendo, hairpin down, very unusual. Oh, there's a great example in the middle of the second bar. There's a staccato stroke, isn't there?
Mm.
And you would never do an accent on that note. It's got a diminuendo down, just a feminine ending. So it goes to the softest note is the third note of the bar.
Mm.
And then this is actually, I shouldn't have said that about he never puts strokes underneath slurs. Here he does. And I think maybe those are supposed to be quite short and separate, but under one bow like that. Very unusual to do that in a thematic way. So he has used a lot here. If he'd gone on writing quartets, we might have seen the biggest difference of all at this point. But in the rest of them, I don't think there is that much. You begin to see a few mezzo voce, sotto voce markings, which again, there were things he didn't use. Mezzo voce particularly, he didn't use much. So that, yes, that is quite sophisticated. You can see how, I mean, that's quite hard to interpret too, isn't it? That beginning. Exactly what does he mean? And it feels so awkward if you start on a down bow that the strongest note, which is maybe the first note of the second bar, harmonically speaking, is going to be on the up bow. And then the end of the phrase is going to be very awkwardly on a down bow. You really want that second bar to begin on a down bow. I suppose lots of people take two bows in the first bar. That's the kind of thing, you could never put that in as an editor because you would make that decision. There are different solutions. I've known people even start on up bow, that movement, but you can't decide. You just have to leave that question open. And isn't it wonderful that, you know, hundreds of years after, we're still talking about what he meant. I think it's fantastic that he left it open. You think of today's composers, it's all done on a computer. And you know, there's no doubt about what they wrote. Except, of course, I'm speaking for myself anyway, when I write a piece and it has its first performance and I make changes and then there's the new version and then there's another new version and it goes on. So even that, there's going to be different versions. I don't know whether editors in 100 years' time will be looking at all the different versions of, I mean, not mine, but I mean a composer who maybe made quite a few changes and think, well, actually, his first version was the best. So that's what we'll publish.
So when you refer to autograph,
yeah,
most likely, most of the time, it is single part. Is it?
Single? No, autographs would always be at scores with Haydn.
Four.
Yeah.
And then you have the.
But
so
Haydn
score exist.
Yes, well, about less than half quartets. There are fewer than half of the autograph manuscripts around. I suppose some could still turn up. I mean, the Opus 20s was so interesting. They disappeared for years and years and years. And then somehow Brahms got hold of them. He actually owned them. He loved Haydn quartet so much. He managed to get the manuscripts of the Opus 20s for himself. And all the little fugues, I mean, he numbered the subjects in pencil on the score. He actually wrote on Haydn's autograph manuscript. Amazing thing to do. It's fascinating what happened, and so sad that so many disappeared. Although I did think as I went on making the edition, sometimes it was slightly easier preparing an opus of Haydn quartets where there were no autographs of any of that opus. Because you did not have to sort of those sleepless nights trying to work out what you thought he might have meant.
We're going really over time, Simon, but I just wanted to just kind of give this two more questions from the members. Would you ornament differently in a live performance and for recording?
Would you, sorry, say that again?
Would you ornament differently in a live performance and for, I think
I
it's
suppose so.
In
the nature of doing ornamentation is that something you would do spontaneously.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, definitely.
Oh, sorry. And last question, which is your favorite set of Haydn quartets? Do you have any?
It's so hard. Can I have two? Could I have Opus 20 and Opus 64? I love Opus 64 number 3. I think it's the most wonderful piece. Yeah.
Great.
But they just go on, you know, one masterpiece after another, really.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. I think we should probably wrap it up. Do you think, everyone?
Yeah.
We're so grateful. It was fascinating, and you're so accommodating with questions, and also going over by 25 minutes. That's really nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Feels like the time has flown very quickly, and thank you for asking me such interesting things. And it's always lovely to talk about it. We'll do an encore if ever you want to.
Yes.
I'll come up with more questions when you do.
Yeah. So we have this is the first month of the 3 months, and so we will be exploring Opus 50 number 4 and time rides to follow. So we have so much more to kind of digest, inspirations, and then amazing things we learned today. Thank you so much.
Let me know when you're playing some in public. I mean, really live.
Yeah.
I'd love to come and hear you play some Haydn soon. Okay.
We'll be in touch. We'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to see you all.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone else. All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Wonderful morning.
We'll see the rest of you tomorrow, won't we? Or, tomorrow in the morning or the evening, or both.
Okay. Oh yes, I have some ideas. I think we should look into our scores, look into those little points, and think of some differences we could do playing wise. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
To look at all those commentary. I'm inspired.
Good.
Great.
Thanks. Bye.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye bye.